The locket was gone, and with it, the last piece of her mother's heart that Naomi Ellsworth had ever been able to hold in her hands. She stood in the middle of the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878, her fingers pressed flat against the hollow of her throat where the gold chain usually rested, and she felt the absence like a wound. Around her, the town moved with its usual rough indifference, wagon wheels grinding over sun-baked earth, men in wide-brimmed hats calling to one another across the street, a dog sleeping in a sliver of shade near the general store. The world continued, entirely unbothered, while Naomi's chest caved in on itself with something that felt dangerously close to grief. She retraced her steps from the morning, walking back toward the livery stable where she had hired a horse for the ride out to the Pemberton farm. She had gone to deliver a letter for Mrs. Pemberton, whose eyesight had grown too poor for reading, a small task she had taken on voluntarily since she'd arrived in Caldwell 3 months ago. The locket had been around her neck when she left. She was almost certain of that. Almost. The livery smelled of hay and horses and the particular warmth of large animals in a small space, and the man at the door, a wide fellow named Hector with a permanently sunburned nose, shook his head when she described the locket. Gold, oval-shaped, just smaller than a silver dollar with a tiny painted miniature of her mother inside. He had not seen it. He was sorry. Naomi thanked him with more composure than she felt and stepped back out into the glare of the Kansas afternoon. She pressed her lips together and told herself that she would not cry on a public street. She was 24 years old. She had come to Caldwell to build something of her own after the death of her father left her with very little and a farmhouse in Missouri that had been mortgaged twice over. She had sold it, packed what she could carry, and come west, because that was what people did in 1878 when there was nothing left to stay for. She had taken a position as a school teacher, the only woman in town qualified for it, and she had been careful and precise and determined not to fall apart. The locket made falling apart feel very close. It had belonged to her mother, Naomi Ellsworth, who had died when Naomi was 11. The miniature inside was the only painted likeness Naomi had of her face. The chain was real gold, thin and delicate, and on the back of the oval casing her father had inscribed a small sentiment, barely legible unless you held it in good light and squinted. For always yours. It was the most romantic thing her quiet, stoic father had ever done, and Naomi had carried it with her for 13 years as a reminder that love like that had existed once, in her family, in the world, and might therefore exist again. She walked slowly back toward her rented room above the dry goods store and told herself to think practically. If it had fallen from her neck on the road to the Pemberton farm, it was gone. The Kansas prairie grass swallowed small things and gave them back only when it wanted to. She would post a notice. She would offer a reward, though she had very little to spare. She would accept it the way she had accepted other losses, quietly and with her spine straight. She was almost at the door of the dry goods store when she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am," she turned. The man standing in the middle of the street was tall, with the kind of build that came from years of outdoor labor rather than from any deliberate effort. His hat was the color of tobacco, well worn, the brim shaped by the habit of a hand that pushed it back when he was thinking. His coat was trail dusty and his boots were cracked at the toe on the left side, but his eyes, when she met them, were extraordinarily clear, gray, like the sky before rain, and watching her with an attention that was direct without being rude. He was holding something in his right hand. He held it out toward her, and Naomi's breath left her body entirely. It was the locket. She crossed the distance between them without fully deciding to move, and he dropped it into her outstretched palm with a care that surprised her, as though he understood it was fragile. She closed her fingers around it and felt the familiar weight and warmth of the gold and had to press her lips together very hard to keep herself composed. "Where did you find this?" she managed. "About a mile south on the road to the Pemberton place," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to long silences. It was lying in the wheel rut. Must have fallen off somewhere along the way. The clasp looks worn, it doesn't close right anymore. She turned it over in her hand, running her thumb across the engraving on the back, the familiar script, for E, always yours, and her eyes stung. She blinked hard. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "This was my mother's. I've been looking for it all morning." "I figured it meant something to someone," he said simply. "That's why I rode into town." She looked up at him properly for the first time. He had a day's worth of stubble on his jaw and a small scar near his left eyebrow, pale against the brown of his skin. He looked to be somewhere in his late 20s, perhaps 28 or 29, with the particular quietness of a man who had spent a great deal of time alone with wide landscapes. "I'm Naomi Ellsworth," she said. "The school teacher. I should like to pay you something for your trouble." "No trouble," he said. "And I know who you are, Miss Ellsworth. You taught my neighbor's boy for a week before he went back to helping with the cattle drive. He spoke well of you." "Who is your neighbor?" "Ed Carver. I'm Robert Keating. I work a spread about 4 miles east of town." She nodded and looked down at the locket again. The clasp was indeed broken, the little hook bent out of shape. She had not noticed it failing. She made a mental note to take it to the silversmith on Thursday. "Mr. Keating," she said, "I am genuinely grateful. This locket is irreplaceable to me." "I could see that it would be," he said, with a quiet simplicity that made her glance up at him again. There was no performance in the way he said it, no flattery, just a straightforward acknowledgement of what was true. The afternoon light was pressing down on the street around them, and somewhere down the way the blacksmith was hammering at something, and a child ran past chasing a chicken with enormous dedication, and Naomi Ellsworth stood on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, holding her mother's locket, and felt something strange and warm move through her that she had not felt in a very long time. "Can I offer you coffee at least?" she asked, and was mildly surprised at herself for asking. "The hotel keeps a good pot going in the afternoons." "It would only be a small thing compared to what you've done." Robert Keating looked at her for a moment, and she could not quite read the expression that passed through his gray eyes. He pushed his hat back with 2 fingers, that habitual gesture she had already noticed, and nodded once. "I'd appreciate that," he said. The Caldwell Hotel's front parlor was modest but clean, with 4 small tables near the front window, and a woman named Mrs. Greer who managed the coffee pot with an iron fist and enormous personal pride. She brought 2 cups without being asked, gave Robert a long appraising look that he appeared not to notice, and retreated to her post behind the desk. They sat across from each other, and Naomi set the locket on the table between them while she warmed her hands on the cup. She had not realized how cold her fingers were from nerves. "You found it in the wheel rut," she said. "You must have been on the same road." "I was coming from the Tillman place," he said. "I've been helping with a fence repair. I almost rode past it, the light caught it just right." "Lucky," she said. "For you or for me?" he asked, and then seemed to surprise himself with the question. A faint color came into the skin above his collar. "I only meant, it seems like luck was on both sides. You get back what you lost." "I get decent coffee in the afternoon instead of what I make for myself." Naomi found herself smiling at that. It was an unexpected thing, and it made the tight knot in her chest ease by several degrees. "Is your coffee very bad?" "Terrible," he said, with complete and serious conviction. She laughed, and the sound of it seemed to surprise them both in the way that laughter sometimes does when it comes out of a place where you were not expecting it. She learned, over the next quarter of an hour, that Robert Keating had come to Kansas 3 years ago from Texas, where he had been born and raised on his father's cattle ranch. His father had died in 1875, and the ranch had been sold to pay debts Robert had known nothing about until the creditors came, which had been, he said without much visible emotion, an education. He had come north with a few horses and a bedroll and enough skill to hire himself out, and had eventually saved enough to lease 40 acres east of town, which he was working toward buying outright. He did not tell her this as though it were a sad story. He told it the way a man tells the history of a place he has been through, noting the landmarks without self-pity. Naomi found this quality extraordinary. She had met a great many men in Caldwell who wore their hardships like medals and expected to be thanked for them. She told him about Missouri, about her father's farm, about the mortgage and the sale and the decision to come west. She mentioned her position at the school, the 12 children she was currently teaching, and the particular challenge of getting any of them to sit still for arithmetic. He listened the way he seemed to do everything, with full and quiet attention. "Do you like it here?" he asked. Caldwell, she considered the question honestly. "I like having a purpose," she said. "I like the children. The town itself is," she paused, "it is rougher than I expected. There are things that happen here that I did not anticipate." This was a careful way of saying that Caldwell in 1878 was not a gentle place. It sat on the Kishom Trail and received cattle drives throughout the summer season, which meant it also received the men who came with the drives, cowboys, drifters, gamblers, men with money to spend, and a desire to spend it in ways that were not always peaceful. The town had a marshal, a man named Price who was competent enough. But even so, there were nights when the sounds coming from the saloons made Naomi pull her pillow over her head and recite poetry to herself until it was quiet. Robert nodded as though he understood what she meant without needing it spelled out. "The drives bring a certain kind of atmosphere," he said. "A certain kind," she agreed. Outside the window, a group of trail hands rode past at a pace that was too fast for the street, and one of them shouted something that made a woman on the boardwalk step quickly back into the nearest doorway. Robert watched them go with the steady, unimpressed gaze of a man who had seen it all before and had made his peace with not being surprised by it. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "The roughness of it?" "It is what it is," he said. "The West has always been a place where the rules are still being written. Some people take that as permission to be lawless. Others take it as a chance to build something." He picked up his coffee cup. "I prefer to build something." Naomi looked at him across the small table with the late afternoon light coming through the window and the locket lying between them like a promise she had not yet made, and she thought that she had not expected the day to end like this when it had started with a knot of panic in her throat and empty hands. "Well," she said, when the cups were empty and Mrs. Greer was beginning to make the particular kind of pointed noise that indicated she wished to reclaim the table, "thank you again, Mr. Keating. Truly." He stood when she stood, which many men in Caldwell did not bother to do, and held the door for her as they stepped back out onto the street. The sun was lower now, going gold and orange in the west, and the main street had taken on the particular quality of early evening, still busy but with a different kind of energy coming into it. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, when they were standing on the boardwalk, "I ride past this end of town on Tuesday mornings. If you ever need anything carried or any word sent out toward the East Farms, I'm not offering it as a grand service, only as a neighbor." It was a modest and carefully worded thing to say. She appreciated the care in it. "Thank you," she said. "I'll remember that." She went upstairs to her room, sat on the edge of her bed with the locket in her palm and looked at it for a long time. She was going to take it to the silversmith. She was going to have the clasp repaired. She was going to go on with her life in the careful and purposeful way she had been going on with it since she arrived. But she was also thinking about gray eyes and a voice like slow water over flat stone, and she was aware that she would be thinking about them for the rest of the evening whether she wanted to or not. The following Tuesday, Robert Keating rode past the end of town at 8:30 in the morning, and Naomi Ellsworth happened to be standing outside the dry goods store with a letter in her hand that needed to go to the Harlan farm, which was 2 miles east of town, and which she had no particular means of getting there herself that morning. She almost did not call out to him. She would reflect on this later, on how close she came to simply letting him ride past, telling herself it was an imposition, that she barely knew the man, that she could send the letter another way. But the truth was that the letter was important. It was from Mrs. Harlan's sister in Ohio and had been sitting at the post office for a week because no one had gone that way, and the more honest truth was that she wanted to call out to him. So she did. He pulled up the horse, a brown and white paint with a patient expression, and touched his hat. When she explained about the letter, he took it without hesitation and tucked it carefully into the inside pocket of his coat. "I'll have it there before noon," he said. "I appreciate it," she said. "Could I offer you breakfast?" "The store has biscuits this morning. Mrs. Cleary makes them fresh on Tuesdays." He was clearly debating. She could see the faint consideration moving through his expression. "I don't want to keep you from your school," he said. "School doesn't start until 9, she said. "We have time." They ate biscuits on the front step of the dry goods store because it was a fine morning and the inside of the store was dim and smelled of turpentine. He tied his horse to the post and sat beside her on the step, and they talked about the strange late heat that had persisted into September, and about the rumor that a second railroad spur might come through south of Caldwell, and about a book Naomi had been reading, a novel by George Eliot, which Robert had not read but which he asked her about with the kind of interested questions that suggested he genuinely wanted to understand what the book was about rather than simply waiting for her to stop talking about it. "You read?" she asked, and then immediately wished she had phrased it less bluntly. He looked amused rather than offended. "I do. Not as much as I'd like. Time is not always generous on a working spread, but yes," he paused. "My mother was a schoolteacher, actually." Naomi looked at him with surprise. "Was she?" "In Texas, before she married my father." He looked out at the street with an expression she could not quite decode. "She taught me to read before I ever went to a proper school, said it was the most important thing she could give me." He was quiet for a moment. "She died when I was 16, fever." "I'm sorry," Naomi said, and meant it with the particular depth that only someone who has lost a mother early can mean it. He looked at her and something shifted between them in the morning light, a recognition of the specific, quiet club of the motherless, which has no membership rules and requires no ceremony but knows its own members on sight. "You understand that," he said. It was not a question. "My mother died when I was 11, she said. He nodded slowly. "Then you know." "I know," she said. They sat in silence for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have said something true to each other and are letting it settle. "The locket," he said, "that was hers." "Yes, my father had it made for her when they were courting. There is a miniature of her inside, painted on ivory, very small. You can barely make out the details, but I know her face in it." She paused. "It is the only likeness I have of her. And the engraving on the back," he said carefully, as though he had noticed it but was unsure whether to mention it. She looked up. "You saw it?" "I did. I wasn't prying. I turned it over to see if there was any identification, any name. There was only the inscription." He met her eyes. "For E, always yours." She nodded. Her name was Eleanor. He called her E. She swallowed. "My father was a quiet man. He did not often say things outright. But he had that made before they were married, and he gave it to her with those words, and she wore it every day until she died. Then he gave it to me." "Your father sounds like a man who knew the value of things," Robert said. "He did," she agreed. "He just didn't always know how to say so." There was a bell from somewhere down the street, and Naomi realized with a start that it was closer to 9 than she had thought. She stood, brushing biscuit crumbs from her skirt, and Robert stood with her. "Don't forget about the Harlan letter," she said. "It's in my pocket," he said, patting the spot. "Safe as can be." He rode east. She walked to the schoolhouse with a warmth in her chest that she was beginning to suspect was not entirely due to the morning sun. October arrived, and with it, the first real chill off the plains. The cattle drives wound down for the season, and Caldwell exhaled slightly, the frenetic energy of summer replaced by something steadier and more sustainable. Naomi put extra wood on her stove in the evenings and corrected arithmetic papers by lamplight and wrote letters to her cousin in St. Louis, who was the closest thing to family she had left. She saw Robert on Tuesdays, which had become a quiet and unremarked-upon habit. Sometimes he had nothing in particular to carry to the East Farms, and she had nothing in particular to send, but they found themselves eating breakfast on the step of the dry goods store and talking for as long as they could justify, which was usually not long enough. He told her about the work on his spread, the fence repairs, the trouble he was having with his water supply, the 2 horses he was training with a patience and gentleness that struck her as characteristic of everything about him. She told him about the children, about the small dramas of a frontier schoolroom, about the arithmetic problems she invented herself because the textbooks they had were outdated and badly organized. He brought her a book once, a collection of essays, worn at the spine, that he said had been his mother's and that he thought she might enjoy. She read it in 3 days and gave it back to him with a page of notes she had written on a separate piece of paper, her observations and arguments and the places where she agreed or disagreed with the author. He read her notes with great seriousness and wrote her a response. They were corresponding in the margins of conversations, she realized. Building something out of words and Tuesday mornings and small acts of attention, and she was aware that she was building it deliberately, that she was choosing it, and that the choice was not something she had made lightly. She was also aware that Robert was careful with her. He did not push. He did not assume. He maintained a respectful distance even as the distance between them in every other sense was quietly, steadily shrinking. She appreciated this enormously and found it at the same time slightly maddening, which was not a rational response but was a thoroughly human one. In early November, there was a dance. Caldwell held dances in the town hall every other month, organized by the Ladies' Auxiliary with an efficiency that Naomi had come to deeply admire. The music was provided by whoever could be coaxed into playing, usually a fiddle and a guitar, and occasionally a man named Mr. Abernathy on the harmonica, and the dancing was enthusiastic if not always technically proficient. Naomi wore her good dress, which was green wool, well-made and several years old but still respectable. She pinned the locket at her throat. She had taken it to the silversmith in October, and he had fixed the clasp and polished the gold until it glowed, and she arrived at the town hall with her landlady, Mrs. Fitch, who came to every dance and danced with determined energy until her feet gave out. She spotted Robert almost immediately. He was standing near the wall with Ed Carver, his neighbor, and he was wearing a clean white shirt and his second-best hat, and he was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who had been trying not to look at someone and has just failed at it. She smiled at him across the room, and he smiled back. A full, genuine smile, less guarded than his usual expression, and it rearranged his face into something that made her stomach do a thing she was not going to think too carefully about. He asked her to dance at the second song, which was a reel, fast enough that conversation was largely impossible, and the only communication available was through the movements of the dance itself, the clasping of hands, the turns, the moments when the form brought them close and then spun them apart. She was a competent dancer, and he was better than she expected, with a natural sense of rhythm and a steadiness in the hand at her back that made her trust him entirely. After the reel, they stood at the edge of the floor and caught their breath, and Mrs. Greer from the hotel passed them with a tray of cider, and they each took a cup, and Robert looked at her with warm gray eyes and flushed cheeks and said, "You dance well, Miss Ellsworth." "You sound surprised," she said. "I'm not," he said. "I think you do most things well." She looked at him. The room was noisy around them, fiddle and voices and the stamp of boots on the wooden floor, and in the middle of all of it he had just said something that was as close to a declaration as anything she had heard from him. "Robert," she said, because she had been calling him by his first name in her head for weeks now, and it felt dishonest to keep saying Mr. Keating, "you should know I think the same of you." He went very still for just a moment, and then something in his face settled as though a question he had been holding had just received its answer. "Would you like to take a walk?" he asked. "There is a lamp on the porch. We could get some air." "Yes," she said. The porch of the town hall looked out over the dark stretch of the main street, lit here and there by the windows of the saloon and the hotel. The night was cold and clear, the stars extraordinary in the way that Kansas stars are extraordinary without mountains or trees or much of anything to interfere with them. They occupied the whole sky in a way that felt almost aggressive. Naomi could see her breath in the lamplight. Robert stood beside her at the porch railing, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. "I have been wanting to say something to you," he said after a moment, "for several weeks now. I have been waiting until I was sure I was saying it right." She turned to look at his profile. "And are you sure now?" "Not entirely," he admitted. "But I think I have waited long enough." She waited. "I admire you," he said. "I have admired you since that first afternoon with the locket, when you were so clearly trying not to fall apart, and doing such a good job of it that I almost missed it. And every Tuesday since then, and the book notes, and the way you talk about those children in your schoolroom like they are the most important people in the world. I admire all of it." He paused. "And I would very much like, if you would allow it, to call on you properly, to make my intentions clear." The night was quiet for a beat, just the far-off fiddle and the stars. "Your intentions," she said, testing the word. "My intentions," he repeated with a steadiness that left no room for ambiguity, "are honorable, Miss Ellsworth, and they are significant. I don't say this lightly." "I know you don't," she said. "You don't say anything lightly. I have noticed that about you." He turned to look at her then fully, and the lamplight was warm between them. "Naomi," he said, and her name in his mouth was something different than it had ever been before, deliberate and careful and weighted with meaning. "Yes," she said before he could say anything else. He blinked. "Yes. Yes, you may call on me properly. Yes, your intentions are understood. Yes." She held his gaze. "I have been waiting for you to say this since approximately the fourth Tuesday." He looked at her for a long moment, and then made a sound that was low and warm and was, she realized, a laugh, a real one, surprised out of him the same way her first laugh in the hotel parlor had been surprised out of her. "The fourth Tuesday," he said. "You are very cautious," she said. "I wanted to be sure I was worth your while," he said, and it was said simply, without self-deprecation or performance, just a plain truth, and it landed somewhere behind her sternum and stayed there. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, gloved fingers on the sleeve of his coat, and said, "Robert Keating, you have been worth my while since the first day." The locket was the beginning of it. He covered her hand with his, and they stood like that in the cold Kansas night, with the stars overhead and the fiddle music coming faintly from inside. And Naomi felt something she had not felt since before her mother died, since before her father's slow withdrawal into grief and debt, and eventually the grave himself. She felt safe. Not sheltered from the world, not protected from hardship, but safe in the specific and irreplaceable sense of being in the presence of someone who sees you clearly and chooses to stay. The calling on began in earnest in November, with Robert riding into town twice a week rather than once, and the Tuesday breakfasts extending into longer mornings when the school schedule permitted. He came on Sunday afternoons, which was the most respectable arrangement, and they sat in the parlor of Mrs. Fitch's house, which Mrs. Fitch vacated with tactful speed every time Robert arrived, citing errands she had just remembered. They talked for hours. About everything, about nothing in particular, about the things that mattered most to each of them. He told her about growing up in Texas, about the vastness of his father's land before the debts took it, about a childhood spent largely outdoors with a horse and a horizon. She told him about Missouri, about the particular smell of the apple orchard behind the farmhouse, about her father's hands, large and patient, teaching her to read with the same Bible her grandmother had used. She showed him the inside of the locket one Sunday afternoon in December, opening it carefully and holding it toward the light from the window so he could see the small painted face of Naomi Ellsworth, dark-haired and fine-featured, the same strong jaw that Naomi had, looking out from the oval with an expression of serene dignity. "She was beautiful," Robert said. "She was," Naomi agreed. "I look like her, or so my father always said. I've never been entirely sure. The miniature is so small." "You do look like her," he said, with a certainty that made her glance up at him. "The jaw, the set of the eyes. You can tell that from a miniature." "I can tell it from looking at you," he said simply. She closed the locket and held it in her palm for a moment. "My father gave this to her when he asked her to marry him," she said. "He put the inscription on the back, 'For E, always yours.' He had it made especially. The jeweler in their town was apparently deeply moved by his instructions." She smiled at the thought. "My father described the jeweler as a sentimental man, which I believe was his way of describing himself." Robert was quiet, looking at her with those gray eyes that she had come to know as well as she knew the landscape outside the schoolhouse window. "Your father sounds like a man I would have liked," he said. "I think you would have gotten along," she said. "He was a man of few words and great depths. You would have understood each other." She tucked the locket back against her throat, and Robert reached over without quite seeming to decide to do it and touched the clasp lightly, checking it, making sure it was secure. His fingers barely grazed the skin at the back of her neck, just a breath of contact, and she felt it from the top of her spine to the soles of her feet. "The silversmith did good work," he said, his voice slightly different from a moment before. "He did," she agreed, equally carefully. They looked at each other, and everything that was not being said moved in the air between them like weather. "Naomi," he began. "Robert," she said at the same moment. They both stopped. Then she laughed, and he did too, and the moment released itself into something warmer and easier, and he reached across and took her hand, holding it in both of his, which were large and were roughened and warm, and said, "I don't want to rush you." "I know," she said. "I don't feel rushed." "I want to say things to you," he said. "Things that require ground, that require knowing each other well enough. And I think we are almost there, but I want to make sure you feel that too." "I feel that too," she said. "Good," he said, and pressed her hand gently between his and said nothing more, because he did not need to, because they both understood. Christmas came to Caldwell with cold wind and frost on the windows, and the schoolchildren making paper chains and reciting verses about snow, which most of them had seen plenty of, and which still retained its festive power in December. Naomi organized a small pageant for the last day before the holiday break, and she was so absorbed in the rehearsals that she almost did not notice Robert arrive at the back of the schoolroom and stand quietly near the door for the last 20 minutes of it. She noticed. She had the particular awareness of him now that she suspected would never fully go away, a sense of his presence in a room the way you have a sense of a lamp being lit. After the last child had gone home with their paper chain and their candy stick, he came forward from the back of the room and said, "That was something, Naomi." She was stacking the last of the papers on her desk and felt her cheeks warm. "They do very well when they put their minds to it." "You do well," he said. "The way you made Tommy Birch feel like his 3 lines were the most important part of the whole thing. His mother will treasure that." She looked at him. Tommy Birch was a small, serious boy who spoke so quietly you had to lean close to hear him, and who had been terrified of his 3-line part, and whom she had spent considerable private time rehearsing with until he could say them with something approaching confidence. "How did you know about Tommy Birch?" she asked. "His mother told me. She was outside when I arrived. She was crying, actually, happy crying." He paused. "I wanted to come and see for myself what you were doing in here every day." "And?" she asked. "And I think the people of Caldwell are lucky to have you," he said, and meant it with a plainness that made her throat tighten. She came around from behind the desk and stood close to him, closer than she would have stood 3 months ago, and looked up at his face in the gray December afternoon light coming through the schoolroom windows. "I am going to my cousin's in St. Louis for Christmas," she said. "I'll be gone for 2 weeks." "I know," he said. "You told me." "I wanted to say before I go," she stopped. He was watching her. "I wanted to say that this autumn has been the best I can remember," she said, "in a long time. Perhaps the best, and I think I know it is because of you." He was very still. "I will miss you," she said. "While I'm gone, I thought you should know that." He lifted his hand and touched her face very gently, his thumb against her cheek, and she leaned into it just slightly, just enough. "I will miss you every day," he said. "Come back safe." "I will," she said. He walked her home and said goodbye on the step of the dry goods store, and she watched him ride east into the gray afternoon, and she pressed her hand to the locket at her throat, and thought that the world was a very different place than it had been in September when she stood on this same street in a panic over losing this same piece of gold. She went to St. Louis and spent Christmas with her cousin Clara, who was warm and curious, and asked Naomi many questions about Caldwell, and specifically about the reason for what Clara described as a very particular expression that appeared on Naomi's face whenever she mentioned certain Tuesday morning breakfasts. "There is a man," Clara said, with the satisfied air of someone whose guess has been confirmed by observation. "There is a man," Naomi agreed. "Tell me everything," Clara said. Naomi told her almost everything. She described Robert, his quietness, his steadiness, the way he listened, the way he had ridden into Caldwell to return a locket he found in a wheel rut because he thought it meant something to someone. She described the book and the notes in the margins of conversations. She described the dance and the cold porch and the stars. Clara listened with her chin in her hand and a growing expression of warmth that had very little to do with the fireplace. "Naomi," she said when Naomi finished. "Don't," Naomi said. "I'm only going to say I know what you're going to say. You are in love with him," Clara said. Naomi looked into the fire. "I believe I might be," she said. "Yes." Clara reached across and squeezed her hand. "Good," she said. "You have deserved it long enough." Naomi was back in Caldwell on the 8th of January, 1879, stepping off the southbound coach with her trunk and 2 new books she had bought in St. Louis, and a feeling in her chest that was entirely about the 4 miles between the main street and the east side of town, where a certain 40-acre spread was located. Robert was waiting at the stage stop. She did not know how he had known which coach she would be on. She had not written to tell him because she had not been entirely sure of the schedule herself until she booked it. But there he was with the paint horse and his tobacco-colored hat, standing with his hands in his coat pockets in the January cold, and when she stepped down from the coach and saw him, she stood still for a moment just to take it in. He came forward and took her trunk without asking and said, "Good journey." "Long," she said. "Cold, worth it." She looked at him properly. "How did you know which coach?" "I've been meeting every southbound coach for 2 days," he said, without any particular drama about it, as if this were a reasonable and ordinary thing to do. She looked at him for a long moment. "Robert Keating," she said. "Naomi Ellsworth," he said. "I need to say something to you," she said. "All right," he said, standing in the January wind with her trunk in his hand like it weighed nothing. "I went to St. Louis and I had a very fine Christmas, and I spoke with my cousin and I spent 2 weeks thinking about Caldwell," she said. "And what I found, every time I tried to think about the town itself, was that I was actually thinking about you. About Tuesday mornings and Sunday afternoons, and the way you listen when I speak as though what I'm saying matters, and the way you found my locket in a wheel rut and rode into town to return it because you thought it meant something to someone." She paused. "I am telling you that I love you, Robert. I believe I have been telling you in other ways for months, and I thought you deserved to hear it plainly." The winter wind moved between them. Robert set down the trunk. He stepped forward and took her face in both his hands carefully, as though she were the most valuable thing he had ever held, which she was aware was somewhat more valuable than a locket, but perhaps in the same category of things that he would ride a long way to return safely to their rightful place. "Naomi," he said, low and fervent, "I have loved you since the day you laughed about my terrible coffee. Possibly since the moment I saw you turn around in the middle of the main street with that look on your face when you recognized the locket." She put her hands over his where they held her face. "Since the locket," she said. "Since the locket," he agreed. He kissed her, there in the January cold on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, with the stage coach behind them and the Kansas wind around them and the whole wide sky above. and it was warm and certain and exactly right. The way things are when they have been moving toward a point for long enough that the arriving is not a surprise but a relief. When they stepped apart, she was smiling and so was he, and she thought she had perhaps never seen his face quite this open before, the guardedness gone, the whole of him present and visible. "I have a question to ask you," he said. "Not today, I'm not organized enough for today, but soon." "I know what the question is," she said. "I'd like to ask it properly," he said. "All right," she said. "Ask it properly, I will be here." He picked up her trunk again. "Let me walk you home." "You are entirely too useful," she told him, and he laughed, and she thought that she was going to spend a considerable amount of the rest of her life making him laugh, because it was one of the finest sounds she had ever heard. February in Kansas was reliably brutal, and 1879 was no exception. The cold came down from the north with particular force, and snow fell on and off through the first 2 weeks, keeping the town somewhat shut in and the roads difficult. Robert came into town when he could, which was not as often as either of them would have liked, and on the occasions when the roads were impassable, he sent notes with Ed Carver's eldest son, who made runs between the East farms and town for a small consideration. The notes were wonderful. They were long and thoughtful and contained observations about the weather and the horses, and occasionally a passage from something he had been reading that he thought she would want to argue with, which she usually did, in the return note, and the argument would carry through several exchanges, and end not with a conclusion but with both of them having refined their thinking, which was, Naomi reflected, the best possible outcome of an argument. She kept all the notes in a small wooden box that she had bought at the dry goods store for the purpose, and she was aware this was a sentimental thing to do and did it anyway. On the 15th of February, the roads cleared. Robert rode in at 10 in the morning, stamping snow from his boots on the step of the dry goods store, and Mrs. Fitch, who had been watching through her window upstairs with what she described as a completely innocent interest in weather patterns, reported later to her friend Mrs. Greer that the cowboy had been carrying something in his coat pocket and had looked more nervous than she had ever seen a grown man look on a public street. Robert asked Naomi to walk with him. They went along the edge of the town, past the schoolhouse and down toward the creek that ran south of the main street, frozen now at the edges and moving dark and slow in the middle. It was cold but clear, the sky a hard blue above them, and the snow on the ground had that particular quality of undisturbed snow that made everything look simplified and clean. He stopped near a cottonwood tree that stood at the bend of the creek, leafless and skeletal against the blue sky, and turned to face her. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small object. She looked at it and felt her breath stop. It was a ring. A gold ring, simple and plain, with a small square of deep blue stone set in it that caught the winter light and threw it back in tiny pieces. It was not flashy or extravagant. It was exactly like him, unembellished, solid, chosen with care. "Naomi," he said. His voice was steady, but she could see the cost of the steadiness in the slight tension at the corners of his jaw. "I am not a rich man. I have 40 acres and 2 horses and a house that needs work on the north wall before next winter. I am offering you a life that will require work, that will not always be comfortable, and that I cannot fully predict. The West is what it is." He held her gaze. "But I can promise you that I will spend every day of it making sure that you know you are loved. That what you say and think and feel matters more to me than anything else in the world. That I will listen. That I will be here." He paused. "Naomi Ellsworth, will you marry me?" The cottonwood was bare above them. The creek moved below the ice. The blue sky held. "Yes," she said. "Yes, without reservation or qualification, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and his hands were cold from the winter but steady, and when it was in place he held her hand in both of his and pressed it to his chest, over his heart, and she felt the beat of it. "I found something in a wheel rut," she said, looking up at him. He looked confused for just a moment, and then he understood, and a smile moved across his face. "I found something in the middle of a street," he countered. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he wrapped his around her, and they stood by the frozen creek in the February cold of Kansas, 1879, and she thought that her mother's locket had started this, the loss of it and the finding of it and the man who had put it in her hands with such care, and that wherever her mother was, she hoped she knew. The wedding was held in April, when the Kansas spring had arrived in earnest, and the prairie was green, and the cottonwoods were putting out their first small leaves. Caldwell's minister, a spare man named Reverend Holt, who took his ceremonies seriously, and conducted them with a combination of gravity and warmth that Naomi found deeply right, performed it in the small white church at the end of the main street. Clara came from St. Louis, arriving on the stage 2 days before with her husband James and a trunk full of things she insisted Naomi needed, and which turned out on inspection to include several items that Naomi genuinely did need and would not have thought to prepare. Mrs. Fitch cried at the ceremony and was not embarrassed about it. Mrs. Greer did not cry but pressed Naomi's hand with a grip like iron and said, "Good man." I watched him for months. Ed Carver stood up with Robert, and his wife Marta sat in the front pew and kept handing him her handkerchief, which he handed back after each use with diminishing dignity. Naomi wore the green wool dress, freshly pressed and with new buttons, and the locket at her throat, and when she walked up the aisle of the small church and Robert turned to look at her with those gray eyes gone wide and full, she thought she had never in her life felt so entirely herself, so precisely in the right place at the right time. Reverend Holt asked the questions and they answered them, and when Robert said "I do," he said it with a quiet certainty that filled the small church, and when Naomi said "I do," she said it the same way, because she had never meant anything more in her life. He kissed her, and the small congregation of Caldwell made the appropriate sounds, and Clara sobbed audibly from the third pew, and outside the church the Kansas spring was being exuberant about itself, and Naomi Keating, née Ellsworth, pressed her hand to the locket at her throat and thought, "Good." They had a celebration at the town hall in the evening, the same building where they had danced together in November and stood on the porch under the stars, and now she danced with him as his wife, while Mr. Abernathy played the harmonica with particular feeling, and the fiddle player threw in some extra flourishes, and Naomi thought she could do this particular dance, in this particular life, indefinitely. Moving to the spread 4 miles east was a project that she undertook with the same thoroughness she brought to arithmetic problems. The house was small, 2 rooms and a loft, with the north wall in the condition Robert had warned her about, but it was solid, and it sat on a slight rise that gave a view in 3 directions that she found, after the first week, genuinely remarkable. The light on the Kansas prairie changed every hour, every season, every cloud that moved across the sky, and she found that she never stopped looking at it. She kept the school. She had been afraid they would ask her to leave it when she married. This was not uncommon, as many districts preferred their teachers unmarried. But Caldwell was practical about its school teachers in a way that benefited everyone, and the school board, made up of 3 men who had children in her classroom, arrived at the conclusion without much difficulty that losing their teacher to a technicality was not in their best interest. She continued riding the 4 miles to town 3 days a week on a bay mare that Robert found for her and whose name, bestowed by his previous owner, was apparently Patience, which Naomi felt was either ironic or prophetic depending on the day. They worked on the north wall together in May, Robert managing the structural repairs and Naomi managing the chinking between the logs, with a thoroughness that he watched with admiration and some amusement. She had told him she wanted to understand how the house was put together, and she meant it literally. And by the end of May, she could have described to any interested party exactly how the logs were joined, and where the previous owner had cut corners and where they had not. "You're going to know more about this house than I do by midsummer," he said, one evening when they were sitting on the small front step watching the sunset paint the prairie 6 different colors at once. I intend to, she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they watched the colors fade to gray and then to the blue-black of a plains night, and the stars came out one at a time and then all at once, and she thought that she had been right on the hotel porch last autumn. The Kansas sky, without anything to interrupt it, was very nearly overwhelming. "Robert," she said, "I want to show you something." She took the locket from her throat. She had begun removing it at night and now did so in the evenings on the step, putting it safely in the little bowl she kept on the windowsill for the purpose, and she opened it and held it in the last of the light so he could see her mother's face again. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what it means that you found this, that you came into town to return it, that the whole thing began there." He looked at the miniature with careful attention, as he always did. "I have been thinking the same thing," he said. "My father had the inscription put on the back," she said, "for always yours. When you first found it, you turned it over to look for identification. You saw those words before you knew anything about me or the locket or my mother." "I did," he said. "What did you think when you read it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought that whoever this belonged to, they were loved, and that they would want it back." She closed the locket and held it in her palm and then reached up and fastened it around her own neck again. "We should have something engraved on the back of our wedding rings," she said. "Something for us." He looked at his ring, the same gold she had placed on his finger in the church, plain and strong. "What would you have it say?" he asked. She thought about her father, who had described a jeweler as sentimental as a way of describing himself. She thought about what it meant to love someone plainly and deeply, and to show it through the small, deliberate acts of sustained attention. "Something true," she said, "and simple." In the end they had the silversmith, the same man who had repaired the locket clasp, engrave their initials and a small thing, N and R, found, because that was what had happened. They had found each other, in a wheel rut and in a morning street, and in the space between Tuesday breakfasts and Sunday afternoons and letters written in cold February. And found was the most accurate and the most sufficient word. The summer of 1879 was hot and busy, and full of the ordinary pleasures of a life being built. Naomi's school swelled in the summer months when some families who lived on outlying farms sent children who could not make the journey during the winter, and she had as many as 18 children on some days, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she managed them with a combination of firmness and humor that the children responded to with something approaching devotion. Robert added a small room to the east side of the house that summer, working in the evenings and on weekends when the spread's demands allowed, and Naomi helped where she could and stayed out of the way when she couldn't and brought food and water and commentary with equal regularity. The room was finished in August and she turned it into a study, with shelves he built for her books and a desk positioned to catch the morning light, and she sat in it the first evening and felt, with a specific and particular completeness, that she was home. They had neighbors over for supper in September, Ed and Marta Carver, and the Tillmans from the West, and a family named Breckenridge who had arrived that spring from Illinois and who were finding the West not quite what they had imagined. The supper went long into the evening, with good food and better conversation and laughter that echoed off the walls of the small house and filled it up. After the neighbors went home and the dishes were washed and the lamp was low, Robert sat at the kitchen table and Naomi sat across from him with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and they talked about the evening, the Breckenridges, who were struggling and might need some help getting through their first winter, and the way Marta Carver's eyes had gone soft when she looked at Naomi across the table, a look Naomi could not quite interpret. "She knows something," Robert said. Naomi looked at him. "What do you mean?" He looked at her with the particular steadiness of a man who is waiting to see what she will say. "Oh," Naomi said. She pressed her palm flat against the table and looked at her hand, the ring on her finger with its tiny engraving inside, and then looked up at him. "I was going to tell you this week," she said. "I was waiting to be completely certain." "Are you certain now?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Yes." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. the same gesture as that first Sunday afternoon in Mrs. Fitch's parlor, and his gray eyes were doing something she had never quite seen them do before. They were full completely with something that had no sophisticated name, just the plain, uncomplicated name of joy. "Naomi," he said. "Don't cry," she said, although her own vision was blurring. "I'm not crying," he said, clearly lying. "Good," she said, clearly crying. They sat like that for a long time, with their hands together on the table and the lamp low and the Kansas night outside the window full of stars and summer crickets. And Naomi thought that she had believed, for a long time after her mother died, that the particular quality of love that had produced the locket and its inscription was a thing that existed rarely, if at all, and that she was unlikely to find it. She had believed this quietly and without much self-pity, the way you believe things that simply seem to be true. She had been wrong. Significantly, wonderfully wrong. Their son was born in April of 1880, in the same month as their first wedding anniversary, which Robert said was the best anniversary present he had ever received, and which Naomi, in the immediate aftermath of the labor, said she was glad he felt that way about it. They named him James, after Clara's husband, who was deeply moved by this and wrote a letter from St. Louis that was barely legible because of the water staining that Clara reported was entirely due to a leaking roof and not to any weeping on anyone's part. James was a good baby, which Naomi recognized as a statistical blessing rather than any particular achievement, and he grew through the spring and summer with the robust enthusiasm of a child who has decided that the world is interesting and worth investigating at speed. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, which were, in miniature, equally extraordinary. Robert was magnificent with him. Naomi had believed he would be, from the way she had watched him handle frightened horses and slow students and difficult neighbors, with patience and steadiness, and the particular quality of paying full attention. But watching it in practice was something else entirely. He carried the baby in the crook of one arm while doing things with the other hand that she was not sure she could do with both. He sat with him in the mornings before the day's work began and talked to him with the same serious, full attention he gave to everyone he talked to, as though James's gurgles were contributions to a conversation worth having. "You're telling him about fence posts," Naomi observed one morning from the doorway. "He asked," Robert said, without looking up from James's extremely engaged expression. "He is 4 months old. He has opinions," Robert said firmly. She leaned against the doorframe and watched them, her husband and her son, in the early morning light, and the locket was warm at her throat, and the study was full of books, and the north wall was solid, and the view in 3 directions was impossibly beautiful. And she thought that her father had known, when he had that small piece of gold engraved with 4 words, exactly what he was doing. He was making a record. He was saying, "This is what is true. This is what lasts." The seasons turned, and the small spread east of Caldwell grew. Robert managed to complete the purchase of the 40 acres in 1881, working through the negotiations with the land office in Wichita with a patience and thoroughness that resulted in a deed that he brought home and set on the kitchen table and looked at for a long time without saying anything. "Is it real?" Naomi asked. "It is," he said. She put her hand on the deed beside his and they looked at it together. 40 acres in the state of Kansas, in the name of Robert Thomas Keating. It was a piece of paper, and it was also a thing that his father's debts had taken away, and that he had rebuilt from the ground up with his own hands and his own years and his own stubborn, quiet determination. "We should expand the house," she said. "If you're planning to keep the boy, he'll need a room of his own eventually." "I am planning to keep him," Robert confirmed. "Then we need more rooms," she said. They built them. 2 more over the summer of 1881 with help from Ed Carver and from the Breckenridge man, who had survived his first winter with some assistance and who repaid it now with labor and a natural aptitude for carpentry that nobody had expected. The house grew into something substantial, with a proper parlor and 2 bedrooms, and the study and a kitchen that was large enough to actually cook in, and a front porch that Robert built wide enough to sit on in the evenings, which is what they did every evening that the weather allowed, often with James asleep in the house and the prairie dark and starred around them. It was on the porch one September evening in 1882 that Naomi said, "We are going to need the rooms." Robert looked at her. "The ones we built," she said. "We are going to need them," he understood. The gray eyes went through the same sequence as before, the stillness and then the completeness of joy. "Two," he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Probably one. The doctor says one. But he also said James was going to be a girl, so I take his predictions with some allowance." Robert laughed and pulled her close on the porch step, and she leaned against his shoulder and looked out at the stars over the Kansas plain. "If it is a girl," she said, "I would like to name her Alina." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel the quality of the quiet. It was the warm kind, the thinking kind. "Alina," he said. "Yes." "After my mother," she said, though he knew this. She said it aloud because it felt important to say it aloud, to speak her mother's name into the night air on this particular evening. "Alina," he said again. "It's a good name." "She was a good woman," Naomi said. "I think she would have liked you." "I think I would have liked her," he said. "The baby was a girl, born in March of 1883, and her name was Alina Keating, and she arrived into the world with her father's gray eyes and a temperament that was, from the very beginning, precisely her own, passionate, observant, deeply interested in everything around her. She was nothing like James in disposition, though they adored each other with the uncomplicated fierceness of children close in age, and she was nothing exactly like either of her parents, though she contained parts of both of them, recognizable in moments and then her own again, which was exactly right. Naomi taught Alina her letters when she was 3, sitting at the desk in the study in the morning light the same way Robert's mother had taught him, and she felt the continuity of it move through her like water through a channel, mothers teaching children to read, across years and states and hardships and losses, passing the most important thing forward. James started at the Caldwell school at 6, which was strange for Naomi in the way that anything is strange when you have spent enough time on both sides of a thing. She was his teacher and his mother, and she had to work at keeping those two things in their appropriate lanes, though James made it easier than she expected, because he was a naturally cooperative child who sat in the front row and asked questions that were genuinely interesting. Robert watched this with great amusement and the wisdom not to comment too much on it. In the evenings after the children were in bed, they had the porch and the fire in winter and the conversations that had been building since the first Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1878. The conversations had not run out. She did not think they would. He still brought her books and she still wrote him notes about them, actual letters now on proper paper rather than the scraps of the beginning, and he still responded with arguments and observations, and the occasional passage he had marked, because he thought she would want to argue with it. She found the wooden box of his early notes one day while reorganizing the study, and she sat at the desk and read through them from the beginning, the careful and deliberate and increasingly unguarded handwriting moving through the months of that first winter, and she thought about how much she had not known yet, reading those letters the first time. She had not known that his laugh would become one of her most necessary sounds. She had not known that his hands, which she had noticed as were roughened on the first day, would become the most familiar thing in the world to her, capable of mending a fence or cradling an infant, or touching her face with a gentleness that she still sometimes found startling for its exactness. She put the letters back in the box. She found him in the paddock with Alina, who at 3½ was deeply convinced that she could ride any of the horses and had to be redirected with considerable diplomatic skill. He was demonstrating something to Alina with patient gestures, and Alina was watching with enormous serious eyes and then trying it herself, and Robert was watching her try it with the particular expression he had for both his children, a kind of radiant, attentive pride that he appeared not to know was visible on his face. Naomi stood at the paddock fence and watched them, and the afternoon light was going gold and long across the Kansas grass, and the locket was warm at her throat. She touched it. She had thought about this a great deal over the years, what it meant that the locket had begun everything. She had thought about the specific geometry of it, the lost thing, the found thing, the man who had come to return it because he thought it meant something to someone. She had thought about the inscription, for always yours, and about how her father had pressed love into 4 small words in a piece of gold, and about how that piece of gold had traveled from her mother's throat to her father's hands to hers, through 13 years and a death and a move and a September morning in Caldwell, Kansas, and had found its way back to her through the hands of a man who would become her husband. She had thought about how close it had all come to not happening. If she had noticed the clasp was failing before she rode to the Pemberton place, if the locket had fallen in the grass rather than the wheel rut where the light caught it, if Robert had been riding a different road that day, or if he had found it and pocketed it and not thought to ride into town. She did not spend very long on these thoughts, because what she had instead of the narrowly missed paths was the wide, solid, living present, the paddock and the horses and the man and the child and the house and the study full of books and the 2 children sleeping in the rooms they had built for them. She had this, and it was more than enough. It was more than she had known to hope for. She opened the paddock gate and went in. Robert looked up from a leaner's lesson, and his face did what it always did when she entered a room or a field or any space where he was. It opened, the way a window opens on a warm day. "Mama," Eleanor said, with the tremendous urgency of a 3-year-old, "Papa is showing me how to tell the horse I am trustworthy." "Is he?" Naomi said, coming to stand beside them. "You have to be very calm," Eleanor said seriously, "and you have to breathe slowly and then the horse knows you." "Where did you learn that?" Naomi asked Robert over Eleanor's head. "My mother told it to me," he said. "She said it works on horses and people equally." "She was right," Naomi said. He looked at her with that open, warm expression, and she looked back at him, and Eleanor, sensing the grown-up moment passing over her head, tugged at her father's hand with the confidence of someone who has never once doubted that her father's attention will return to her, which it immediately did. Naomi touched the locket at her throat. "For always yours, Eleanor." And before that, by the logic of love passing itself forward through time, her mother Eleanor, who had worn this same piece of gold and been loved absolutely by a quiet man who expressed it in 4 words pressed into metal. Now here, in a paddock in Kansas in the autumn of 1883, his granddaughter, carrying the name forward, learning from her father how to make a frightened animal trust you. Things carry themselves forward, Naomi thought. Love is one of them. She had written to Clara about this once, about the particular weight of the locket not as an object but as a record, and Clara had written back with her characteristic warmth and her characteristic directness. "You found a man who understood what things mean." That is not a small thing, Naomi. That is everything. It was, Naomi thought, watching Robert crouch down to Eleanor's level and demonstrate something with his hands, everything. The years moved through Caldwell, and through the Keating spread with the pace of real life, which is to say that some parts were hard, and some parts were beautiful, and many parts were both at once. There were difficult winters and dry summers, and a year when the cattle market went through a rough patch that required them to be careful for 12 months in ways they had not needed to be careful before. Robert worked through it with the same steadiness that characterized everything he did, and Naomi worked through it alongside him, and on the other side of it they were, if anything, solider than before. James grew from a cooperative 6-year-old into a thoughtful 12-year-old, with a particular aptitude for mathematics that delighted his mother, and an interest in horses that delighted his father. And he showed every sign of becoming someone who would be good at whatever he decided to do. Eleanor grew from an opinionated 3-year-old into an opinionated 9-year-old with a reading speed that alarmed her teachers slightly, and a personality that was, as it had been from the beginning, entirely her own. In the autumn of 1888, with James 13 and Eleanor 9, Naomi found herself standing in the study on a Sunday morning, looking at the shelf of books that had grown from a handful to a substantial collection, many of them brought by Robert over the years, many of them brought by herself, some of them sent by Clara, some of them carried back from trips to Wichita where the bookshop was better. The walls of the study were covered in the small artifacts of a life lived carefully and fully. A drawing Eleanor had made of the horses at age 5, framed because it was genuinely very good, a pressed flower from the first spring they had spent on the spread, a small map of Kansas that James had drawn for a school project and that happened to be more accurate than the published one. And on the windowsill, in its small ceramic bowl, the locket. She picked it up. The gold had the particular warmth of old gold, the warm amber color that comes from years of being worn against skin, and the clasp that the silversmith had repaired in 1878 had been repaired twice more since then, most recently by Robert himself, who had learned a small amount of metalworking out of practical necessity, and who had fixed it with a concentration and delicacy that she had found unexpectedly moving to watch. She opened it. Her mother's face looked back at her from the ivory miniature, small and fine and familiar after all these years. The dark hair, the clear eyes, the jaw that Naomi saw in the mirror and had seen on Eleanor since the day Eleanor arrived. "Hello, Mama," she said. The morning light came through the study window, and the house made its quiet, inhabited sounds around her, Robert moving in the kitchen, the sound of James's boots on the floor of his room overhead, Eleanor's voice in the yard, calling to something, probably the cat that had appeared uninvited in the spring and been adopted with unanimous enthusiasm. She turned the locket over and read the inscription one more time. "For E, always yours." She had read it 10,000 times, or close enough to make no difference, and it was as clear and true as it had been the day her father placed it in her hands with the solemnity of a man who was giving away the most important thing he had left to give. She had carried it through Missouri and Kansas and grief and the beginning of her own life. She had lost it, and it had been found by a man who understood what it meant for something to matter, who had ridden into town not because he expected a reward but because he thought someone would want it back. And someone had. And in getting it back, she had gotten something else, something she had not known she was missing until she stood on a main street in 1878 and turned around and saw a tall man with gray eyes holding her locket out to her with a care that told her everything she needed to know. She heard Robert's step in the hallway, and then he was at the study door, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he looked at her standing by the window with the locket in her hand and did not say anything for a moment, just looked at her with the expression she knew better than she knew anything. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He came in and set a cup beside her and looked at the locket in her hand. "The inscription," she said, though she did not need to explain because he knew. "I know," he said. "For E," she said. "And you found it, and now there is another E." Eleanor, she looked up at him. "Do you think he knew my father?" "I think your father put those words on a piece of gold because he loved your mother," Robert said, "and the rest of it came from there. Things carry forward from love. They just do." She looked at him for a long moment, this man with the gray eyes and the hands that could mend fences and hold infants, and touch her face with equal precision. This man who had ridden 4 miles to return something he found in a wheel rut because he thought it meant something to someone. "They do," she agreed. She put the locket back on, and his hands were there at her neck, fastening the clasp with the familiar care, and she felt the weight of the gold settle against her collarbone where it had lived for so many years. "Come have coffee on the porch," he said, "before the children take over the morning." She followed him out, through the kitchen and onto the wide porch he had built wide enough to sit on in the evenings, and they sat down together with their cups and looked out at the Kansas morning, which was doing what Kansas mornings do in October, coming in golden and enormous, the light low and amber over the long grass, the sky above them that extraordinary high blue that she had never gotten over and had stopped trying to get over. Eleanor was in the yard with the cat, conducting some kind of negotiation. James appeared from the barn, having apparently done something useful before anyone asked him to, which was a quality that Naomi was privately convinced he had gotten entirely from his father. He waved at them from the yard and went back to whatever he was doing. Robert put his arm around her shoulder and she leaned into him, as she had done on this porch 100 times, 1,000 times, until the shape of leaning into him was as natural as the shape of the horizon. "Are you happy?" he asked. She thought about the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. She thought about the schoolroom and the children who passed through it, who would carry something of what she taught them forward into lives she would not see. She thought about the study full of books and the conversations that never ran out and the notes in the wooden box and the ring on her finger with its tiny engraving, N and R found. She thought about James and Eleanor, those two entirely themselves people who had come from her body, and from the love between her and this man, and who were now in the yard on an October morning, negotiating with a cat and doing something useful in a barn, respectively. She thought about the locket, which was warm at her throat. She thought about a September morning in 1878, a main street, a pair of gray eyes, and a hand holding out the one thing she had been looking for. "Yes," she said. "I'm very happy, Robert." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and they sat on the porch in the Kansas morning, and the light moved across the prairie the way light does when there is nothing to stop it, wide and golden and going all the way to the edge of the world. The locket rested at her throat. The inscription was there on the back of it as it had always been, "For always yours." She put her hand to it and felt the warmth of the gold and the pulse beneath it, her own steady heartbeat, and she thought that her mother had worn this same warmth and felt this same pulse, and her daughter carried the same name, and the love that had put those words into metal had not diminished by being passed through years and hands and generations, but had in fact grown, the way love does when it is tended, into something large enough for all of them. The October light stretched across the Kansas plain. The children's voices came and went in the yard. Her husband's arm was around her shoulder. The sky was that extraordinary, overwhelming blue. This was the life that had begun with a locket lost in a wheel rut and returned by a man who understood what things mean. This was, in every sense that mattered, exactly where she was supposed to be.